Everybody, I think we're going to get started. Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to see such a big crowd today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melissa Leonard. I am the coordinator for the Student Organization for Latin American Studies. As you saw when you came in, there's some snacks available. There's a sign-in sheet. I'd appreciate it if everybody could sign that. So today, I'm excited to introduce Carson Morris. Carson received her master's degree in Latin American Studies from UNM in 2006 and is currently a doctoral candidate in the history department here at UNM. Her presentation will focus on striptease and other sexual performance in Cold War Chile. So after her presentation, we've set aside some time for audience Q&A. If you have anything you'd like to discuss about the presentation, there will be time for that. So with that, please join me in welcoming Carson Morris.
Thank you, Melissa. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. It is an honor to be here and have the opportunity to share my work with you. I thank all of my professors and colleagues who are in attendance, especially my steadfast advisor, Dr. Hutchison. I would like to extend a very special thanks to the Latin American and Iberian Institute and the Feminist Research Institute for funding my project. This paper comes from chapters I am currently drafting for my dissertation, which looks at the politics of performing beautiful women in Cold War Chile. In these chapters, I am currently grappling with the notion of shame and its construction, which is part of what I'm presenting today. I hope you will find it informative and thought-provoking. I've been asked to speak for 40 minutes and leave 20 minutes for questions. My paper, titled Striptease, Respectability, and Shame, The Politics of Sexual Performance in Cold War Chile, is a queer Cold War political history of sexual performance in urban Chile from 1950 to 1990. By sexual performance, I refer to performance of the body intended to be erotic or seductive in nature. I describe this performance as sexual rather than erotic to also imply the performance of the female sex. For the scope of this paper, I am looking at such performance in cabarets, nightclubs, cafes, and topless businesses, and on television. My source base includes contemporary cabaret review showbooks, photographs, business advertisements, press coverage, state and city laws regulating such businesses, as well as oral histories, memoirs, and testimonies of photographers, dancers, and artists. While I use nude magazines as a primary source space for this study, I am not considering the performance of gender and sexuality in these magazines for this analysis. This project began as an exploration into how beautiful female bodies were constructed, controlled, and performed under changing Cold War political regimes in Chile. Examining women's magazines and beauty contests, I looked for differences in how political parties and regimes constructed nationally representative female bodies and genders. Amidst these changes, I found overarching continuities in the state construction and policing of male and female bodies, and in the naturalization of sexualized definitions of femininity. I also discovered a booming sexual performance market that was well established by the 1950s and flourished through the increasing organization of the left and the presidency of socialist Salvador Allende, the dictatorship, and the return to democracy, despite significant changes in its operation. I argue that this industry transcended state politics of the socialist and communist left and the neoliberal capitalist right, as well as regime politics of democracy and dictatorship. It was, however, highly political in terms of body, gender, and sexuality politics, and was intimately involved in national representation in terms of national and international business and tourism. I argue further that the industry was imbued with different degrees of shame and respectability at different historical and personal moments, and historically served as an emancipatory space for expressing bodies, genders, and sexualities that did not prescribe to state and culturally enforced norms. Scholars of Chile have examined the effects of the September 1973 military coup and long dictatorship on women's rights and sexual freedom, including contemporary feminist issues such as birth control and divorce, as well as early homosexual organizing, seeking to determine to what degree the right-wing dictatorship stunted or advanced policies of sexual liberation. Chilean political historian Veronica Valdivia has looked specifically at topless culture under Chilean dictatorship in the late 1970s and in the 1980s, arguing that the dictatorship's 1978 neoliberal policies encouraged the opening of topless businesses and cafés con piernas, the Chilean cafes where clients are served coffee by sexy women, literally coffee with legs. I will show that such businesses existed long before the dictatorship and its neoliberal policies. Scholar Diana Taylor has examined the performance of sexual violence under Argentine dictatorship, arguing that it is a masochistic phenomenon of dictatorship whereby the state engenders itself as masculine. My work complicates her analysis of sexual performance as inherently masochistic and emphasizes the need to examine what sexual performance looked like under Argentine democracy. Most relevant theoretically, Shane Vogel looks specifically at performances of race and sexuality in Harlem cabarets. He reframes the cabaret as a queer literary and performance tradition in which cultural workers critiqued racial and sexual normativity and imagined alternative narratives of sexual and racial selfhood. He shows how artists work to transform the politics of representation, understanding the cabaret as a space of intimacy that exceeds or eludes sexual categorization. The first main point of my analysis today is that sexual performance in Chile transcends state politics under democracy and dictatorship. The influence of the international Cold War on national Chilean politics is hard to overstate. To give a very brief overview of Cold War Chilean state politics, Chile broke relations with Russia in 1947 because of US pressure. And following decades of communist and leftist organizing, the Chilean Communist Party was banned in 1948 for 10 years. In 1949, women gained the right to vote, participating in their first national election in 1952, helping to elect former dictator Carlos Ibáñez as president. Like Videla before him, Ibáñez entered as a reformist and quickly moved to the right. In 1958, the ban on the Communist Party was lifted, and a socialist communist coalition supporting presidential candidate Salvador Allende came close to beating the US-supported elected conservative President Alessandri. In 1961, President Kennedy initiated the Alliance for Progress, encouraging reforms in Chile and Latin America to curb communist revolution. In 1964, the Popular Front again narrowly lost to US-supported centrist Christian Democrat candidate Eduardo Frei. Despite US efforts to the contrary, in 1970, socialist Salvador Allende was finally elected as president, representing the Unidad Popular, Popular Unity. He served as president until he lost his life in the US-supported violent military coup in 1973 that led to Augusto Pinochet's right-wing dictatorship. A 1988 plebiscite removed Pinochet as president in 1990. The development of Chilean sexual performance and topless culture can clearly be traced back to the 1920s. A 1958 tourism magazine published by the state boasted urban Chile's history of cabarets and nightclubs dating back to the 20s, including Josephine Baker's 1929 tour of Chile. With official police security, she performed sold-out shows in various theaters in Santiago, as well as in Valparaiso, Iquique, and Huarta, though a women's association organized a protest preventing her from performing in Curicó. Chilean cabaret-style businesses were publicized as being modeled after French cabarets, and indeed French words were used in the industry, including boîte, referring in Chile to Chilean nightclubs with sexual performance, and the word vedette for female and transsexual performance artists. 1950s press coverage also made use of the English words topless and striptease. Magazines and newspapers from the 50s through the 80s included coverage of Paris's rich nightlife and cabarets, with pictures. By the 1950s, there was a successful sexual performance industry operating up and down the country, with many theaters in the capital and a collection of bars, hotels, and nightclubs in cities throughout the country. Businesses offered entertainment in the form of beautiful, scantily clad female and transgender dancers, or vedettes. Nighttime shows, called revistas, featured dancing vedettes, stripteases, and comedians. Revistas were offered 7 days a week and multiple times a night in competing businesses. Such businesses were often considered respectable. Some were considered more elegant than others, and many catered to the economic and political and entertainment elite. One ex-vedette describes businessmen coming in on charter planes from Antofagasta in the north of Chile to Santiago to see shows at cabarets, then hitting the topless afterwards. She also mentions foreign clients. The most respectable and high-class of these locales, by all accounts, was the Beam Bam Boom Company, owned by an Uruguayan businessman who went by his artistic name Buddy Day, and operating in a prime location in the Teatro Opera in the center of government and financial buildings. Beam Bam Boom joined the sexy Santiago nightlife when it opened its doors with its first show, Que Churros en Bikini, January 1953. In the 50s and 60s, the company printed review show books, which included photographs, information on the operation of the business, and advertisements for similar businesses. A 1954 advertisement for the King's Club offered shows at 1:30 and 3 a.m. for guests to continue the fun well into the early morning hours, with many of the same artists that performed in Beam Bam Boom. Within a year and a half of opening, Beam Bam Boom boasted that more than 1 million people had attended. Buddy Day brought in talents from Europe and Argentina, but Chileans were also encouraged to try out. A 1969 newspaper advertisement for Beam Bam Boom dancers read, "Do you want to be an artist? Get started in Beam Bam Boom. Requirements, minimum height 1.7 meters. Pretty, good salary, private employee. Try out as soon as possible." 1.7 meters is close to 5'6". I had to look that up too. So, other very well-known and successful 1950s Santiago nighttime show businesses were the Humoresque and the Picaresque. Ernesto Sotolicio, owner of the Picaresque, started a Latin American striptease contest and brought in women from Panama, Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia. Business was good for these club owners. Sotolicio was able to travel to Europe and buy himself a Mercedes-Benz. Certain restaurants and coffee shops also offered sexual entertainment or topless service, such as El Dorado in the business and political center of Santiago. As a restaurant, it paid women less money, but offered them a chance to be seen. Beam Bam Boom show books, while in print, advertised some of these businesses. Countless jokes in nude magazines from the early 1970s referred to men not being able to control their appetites in topless restaurants. There was also mention of Café Haití in the early 1970s, one of the famous cafés con piernas that flourished in the 1980s. A woman I did an oral history with says that as a young girl, her father used to take her to Café Haití in the late 1960s. She said the clientele was generally male, the women were beautiful, and they wore more clothes than the women who worked in later cafés con piernas. Testimonies of vedettes, makeup artists, and photographers all attest to the substantial representation of political authorities in the clientele. These businesses were regulated by the government and taxed under alcohol laws, which required patents on types of businesses. Cabaret patents required those businesses to pay some of the highest alcohol taxes. The only businesses that paid higher alcohol taxes were hotels and restaurants designated specifically for tourism. Cabarets paid more than double the taxes of bars and nightclubs. Alcohol laws also guarantee, present tense still, free access to any establishments that serve alcohol for police, internal tax service, agriculture and livestock inspectors, and city inspectors, essentially granting them free entry to sexual performance businesses. The operation of these businesses was centered around the sale of alcohol. Some women worked in boîtes as copetineras, with the sole purpose of getting clients to consume more alcohol. These women earned a percentage of what they encouraged clients to consume, 10% according to a 1972 copetinera. Many sexual performance artists did not work in boîtes because of the obligation to drink with clients. Over the past 5 years, as part of my research, I attended some of these businesses, including both cafés con piernas and gentlemen's nightclubs. I never saw police coming into the cafés con piernas, but in the nightclubs that serve alcohol, uniformed police officers walked through at their leisure. The September 1973 coup changed Santiago nightlife, but changes were more technical than political. The 9 p.m. curfew, later extended to 2 a.m., gave nightlife businesses a hard hit. Yet despite the curfew and the turbulent political atmosphere, the sexual performance industry continued, adapting in order to survive. One vedette spoke of the chaos in the streets before the coup, but she said she had to go to work. The cabaret closed on September 11, 1973, but opened for 3 days at the end of the same month, moving their 10 p.m. show to 7 p.m. It then reopened in January 1974 and stayed open until its closing in 1986. The continuation of the sexual performance industry throughout the dictatorship can also be seen in popular magazines. Women's magazine Revista Paula included a 1974 piece on Santiago nightclubs and a promotion of a cabaret show. Popular youth music magazine Revista Ritmo advertised the 1974 debut of a new Bim Bam Boom vedette, as well as a new 1975 Bim Bam Boom show. In 1977, Revista Paula promoted the Bim Bam Boom's new show, Feminissima, in multiple editions, although one included a brief commentary that the girls dancing were weak. The show was offered in multiple functions every day of the week, beginning at 7 p.m., with the latest show on Saturdays at 11 p.m. Bim Bam Boom was not the only sexual performance business that continued under the dictatorship. Nightlife reporter and photographer Julio Bustamante said that following the coup, quote, some places continued operating, but quietly, end quote. He recalls one place that opened to the public very discreetly in Santiago, half a block from a police station. In order to enter, one had to knock on the metal doors with a coin, cross a dark hallway, and then go through another door. It was usually full of people. Some businesses started operating from curfew to curfew, such as Il Bosco, which catered mainly to athletes, famous people, and reporters. In November 1973, Isabel Allende wrote a humor piece for Revista Paula on El Toque de Queda, the curfew, saying that it controls the population by having men stay away from home from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. A 1977 Revista Paula article on a nighttime show of semi-nude Arab dancers mentions that Miss Paula, winner of the magazine's beauty contest, Paulina Leighton, was in attendance. By 1979, newspapers were covering Queen of the Topless contests. In the early 1980s, some government officials of the municipality of Santiago made attempts to control such businesses, imposing schedules and restrictions on alcohol sales. They had varying degrees of success depending on the type of business patent each locale was operating with. Nearby municipalities were out of their control completely. When a new curfew was imposed in November 1984, the National Association of Owners and Businesses of Cabarets with Shows sent a letter directly to the dictator, asking him to lengthen the night for business reasons. 1 month later, in December, the curfew was shortened from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. Jose Aravena was known as the godfather of Santiago nightlife, owning many sexual performance businesses across decades. Following his death in 2008, the Chilean Senate included a homage to his life and his 4 decades of contributions to Santiago's nightlife in one of their sessions, noting that the governments of Frei, Allende, Pinochet, and the post-dictatorship return to democracy had all, quote, found in his businesses the space to liberate their captive energies, end quote. They also mentioned the influence of his trip to Paris on the operation of his businesses and the importance of his businesses in attracting international stars to the city. In this homage, the Senate spoke of him providing entertainment for the richest 10% of the population and providing places for investors to invest in a less restricted definition of natural resources. The next main point in my analysis today is that striptease and sexual performance were imbued with different degrees of respectability and shame in Chile at different historical and personal moments. I emphasize the importance of questioning who found such performance shameful. I am not simply arguing that such performance was previously considered respectable, although this argument is certainly present in the memory of many Chileans involved in the sexual performance industry. In a 2012 interview, photographer and cinematographer Pablo Larraín said, quote, "It's funny because the cabaret was very famous back in those days and put on fairly elegant shows. After the coup, it became sort of seedy and run down. We met with some of the women who were there, and some of them came from left-wing families who felt ideologically compromised by their line of work, dancing almost naked to be ogled by an audience of men who represented the bourgeoisie, the patriarchy. Everything that these women did was completely antithetical to socialism, so it would cause shame for their families," end quote. This quote reveals a tendency among some Chileans of the left to equate sexual performance with the right, which I believe I have already shown is not an accurate historical description. Still another example that serves as a counterpoint to such an association comes from Peggy Cordero, a famous vedette for Bim Bam Boom in the early 1970s and a member of the Socialist Party. She says she did it for the money because she was a single mother with a 5-month-old baby when she started. But she does not regret anything. She was the first vedette who had previously had formal training as an actress in the University of Chile. She says it wasn't sexy or glamorous and that her profession was not always respected among party members. But she recounts meeting President Allende in the National Palace. She said she was wearing a miniskirt, he was looking at her legs, and he said to her, "Compañera, what good people we have now in the party." Cordero went into exile following the coup. To be clear, issues of both shame and respectability can be seen throughout the time period I study. Many vedettes say that Bim Bam Boom was not elegant or glamorous. Women were breastfeeding backstage and constantly having to sew up their pantyhose. There are stories of vedettes facing shame and rejection from their families and exploitation by photographers and business owners. But sexual performance is not inherently shameful. As Sally Munt argues, shame is socially constructed. I did not find evidence of sexual performance artists associating shame with their own work. Occasionally they spoke of embarrassment with their first nude performance, but not shame regarding their profession. This doesn't mean it wasn't there, I just didn't find it. To demonstrate that such performance is not inherently shameful, I would like to offer examples of historical sexual performance and ask you to consider what sexual performance meant to these female artists. Throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, shows and cabarets and boîtes were advertised and covered in national newspapers and popular magazines of different political persuasions, with pictures. This was not a hidden market. A 1972 article in Revista Paloma, a magazine of Salvador Allende's Unidad Popular Party, discusses the famous Ubilla clan. The Ubilla clan were 8 sisters and supposedly aunts, nieces, and granddaughters that worked in Beam Bam Boom and other sexual performance businesses over decades. Slide. Isabel Ubilla, oh, I'm sorry, that's Peggy Cordero. I missed a slide. This is the member of the Socialist Party. Here's Isabel Ubilla. She was the first sister to join the business, becoming one of the most famous women in Chile in the 1950s and 60s. She worked in the Beam Bam Boom as well as in the Boîte Mon Bichou. Her father threw her out of the house and she started renting a room with a girlfriend. She was good friends with Beam Bam Boom owner Buddy Day's wife, Marta. Her sister, Elba, also became a vedette, considered the best even among the sisters. Elba married an Ecuadorian millionaire who worked in airline transportation and stopped performing in the cabaret. Another sister, Raquel, married Buddy Day's son, Julio Feliz, and continued to work in the cabaret. She later opened Teatro Providencia in 1989. Another sister, Angelica, worked in the American Bar in Valparaiso until she married the owner's son. Isabel Allende, at the time a writer for women's magazine Revista Paula, also fulfilled a lifelong desire to perform as a Beam Bam Boom dancer, recounting her story in September 1973. Ironically, this article was published in the magazine's first edition following the coup in which her uncle lost the presidency and his life. She feared she was too short to meet the company's height requirements, but she was accepted and performed in a show. In 1975, Isabel Allende also produced her own burlesque-type play called Los Siete Espejos, The Seven Mirrors, referencing a historic brothel of Valparaiso, but performed by unapologetically fat vedettes. She used the cabaret genre to question stereotypes of feminine beauty. Famous Chilean singer Frecio Soto started as a vedette. The semi-nude performances of this Nueva Ola singer were advertised with pictures in popular youth music magazine Revista Ritmo. Once famous, Frecia Soto planned a 1972 performance tour of the whole country, titled, I Want to Be a Vedette. By April 1974, Soto told the magazine that she did not want to be a vedette anymore, and only wanted to focus on singing. They still included a former picture of her in a bikini with the article. There are many other cases of other women who performed as vedettes, advancing their singing and acting careers and becoming highly successful internationally. A 1972 Revista Ritmo article on Santiago nightlife said that cabaret-style businesses in Santiago were not quite as nice as those in other countries, and that many of the shows and other nighttime businesses were of dubious quality. Yet being a striptease artist allowed Paula Denis to tour cities throughout Chile and other Latin American countries. And in 1970, she was headed to perform in a cabaret in Panama owned by a Chilean ex-vedette. Other striptease artists also spoke of their profession, allowing them to travel to other countries. I want to point out some fundamental changes in the operation of Chile's sexual performance industry that may point to an increasing construction of shame surrounding sexual performance. One important difference with the early sexual performance industry and its 1980s counterpart is that under democratic government, many of these businesses catered to both women and men. Elizabeth Ubilla, in late 1970, mentioned that there were señoras, ladies, even in the first row of the Beam Bam Boom audience. Julio Bustamante, photographer and reporter at the time, described the mixed clientele. Quote, people could go with their wives, and the jokes were very tasteful and appropriate, without offensive remarks, because the owner was very careful as to not scare off the clientele. Men went with their wives and girlfriends. End quote. Also recall that in 1977, Revista Paula reported that Miss Paula saw an Arab sexual performance show. But towards the end of the 1970s, there started to appear businesses for men only. The godfather of such businesses, Jose Aravena, opened the discotheque Karim in 1979. Such businesses were advertised to men as a place where they could go and, quote, with a glass of whiskey in hand, imagine that all of these women were his, that he was in his own harem, end quote. By the 1980s, women were no longer generally considered acceptable clientele in sexual performance businesses. A woman that I conducted an oral history with confessed with serious anguish that she worked in the Café con Piernas, Café IT, in the mid to late 80s. Today, this is one of few Cafés con Piernas that caters to men and women, both, usually for business meetings. But at the time she was working there, it was only available to male clientele. By 1984, some businesses experimented with offering ladies' nights once a week, where they could view male dancers. These types of entertainment were not as successful. The sexual performance scene, once a space of intimacies that eluded sexual categorization, had been divided by sex, implying a strict heterosexuality. In my research in cafés con piernas and sexual performance nightclubs, I always attended in the company of a male colleague. Even so, I was seriously discouraged to enter. I was told that it was not appropriate for me. I was asked if I was a journalist, and I was also asked if I wanted to work on stage as a dancer. I declined. Another significant change in the operation of sexual performance businesses is that vedettes moved from nighttime clubs to television, as access to television in Chile increased, and no doubt encouraged by the curfew. Starting in 1978, vedettes were regularly featured semi-nude on the annual telethon to raise money for charity, which is also known by Chileans as La Vedetton. Ex-vedette Maggie Lay, who in 1978 went directly from performing in Bim Bam Boom to starring in the first Vedetton, attributes the failing cabaret industry to the increase in television and then the internet. The show Sabor Latino on national television regularly featured vedettes, and a famous scandal erupted in 1981 when Spanish vedette Maripepa Nieto turned her back to the camera, revealing her bare derriere. Indeed, Sabor Latino's director, Sergio Reisenberg, insinuated that the show was created by the government to distract people from the economic crisis. By 1987, Chile's national TV removed Sabor Latino from their programming, due largely to protests, and according to Reisenberg, there was no longer justification for the show. The Vedetton continued, however, progressing in degrees of nudity allowed, so that in 2012, vedette Sandra Bustamante performed on national TV topless and with her buttocks bare, wearing only high heels and a small green leaf over her nether parts. I don't have a photo for you. Another significant factor in the changing of the imaginaries of sexual performance, respectability, and shame is the association of sexual performance with the dictatorship's military and police. I have already touched on state involvement in the sexual performance industry, and while it is clear that sexual performance was an integral part of urban Chilean political, economic, and entertainment culture before the 1973 dictatorship, sexual performance artists became so closely associated with police and military under the dictatorship. Teresita Rouge, a vedette under the dictatorship, featured semi-nude in newspaper La Tercera in 1975, said in a recent interview that she had to work for the military to earn a living. She was contracted for parties by the military and Air Force, saying that that world was another Chile, different from the one on the streets. She describes how they transported her to and from the shows, so that the curfew was never an issue. She says they were always respectful to her. Despite all of this, she left the country with her husband in 1978. Maggie Lay, famous vedette of the 70s and 80s, also spoke about working for the military. She was contracted to work in special shows, including a private military show in the Hotel Antofagasta, in which Pinochet specifically asked for her performance. And after she danced and tickled his face with her feather boa, Pinochet said to her, "You are very good. You sing and dance well. Good for you." Famous ex-vedette of the 70s and 80s, Mireya Smith, known as Wendy, was engaged to marry a captain of the police force in 1977, but he committed suicide days before their marriage. Sexual performance artist Patricia Maldonado worked in the Boate Hollywood of Valparaiso in the early 1970s. She was recently listed in a popular Chilean magazine as one of the 100 faces of the dictatorship. The article quoted her as saying, "I am not for the political right. I am for Pinochet, and I am going to die being for Pinochet, like it or not." Maldonado's politics aside, the dictatorship in effect co-opted the sexual performance market, thus the association between the two. A last critical factor in understanding changing perceptions of the sexual performance industry is that due to increasing fears over STDs, in 1983, the Regulation of Sexually Transmitted Diseases passed, Article number 13 of which prohibited brothels, which had previously been legal and regulated. I argue that this prohibition blurred the lines between sexual performance businesses and sexual commerce businesses, and imbued sexual performance with a questionable nature. 1980s representations of the sexual performance industry in literature and in the 1987 film Susie portray it as an exploitive industry and illustrate the blurry lines connecting sexual performance and sexual commerce. I also want to mention some other opinions of ex-vedettes on how the industry has changed. Vedettes say that nowadays, vedettes don't dance or sing or act. They have silicone breasts and buttocks, and they take their clothes off quickly without the art of seduction. One says the glamour is not there anymore, and cites the lack of glamorous stage backgrounds and beautiful curtains, as well as the now frequent use of beauty operations. She also had one herself. Their comments bring up a crucial point, though, that sexual performance is an art, or at least it should be. Now that we have questioned the association of sexual performance with shame, I move to the last main point in my analysis today, that sexual performance has the potential to be an emancipatory space for expressing non-normative bodies. My work further demonstrates Vogel's understanding of the cabaret as a space of intimacy that exceeds or eludes sexual categorization, and that worked to transform the politics of representation. I want to mention some cases of important sexually ambiguous transvestite and transsexual artists in Chile's sexual performance industry to further illustrate this point. Vedette Maggie Lay said that there was always transsexuals in the cabaret industry. A 1971 nude magazine included a presumably fictional story of a male client who accidentally took home a transvestite from a boîte. In the 1950s, In the 1950s, Beam Bam Boom director of choreography Eugene Darcy was photographed in a fishnet top with makeup. He was also the choreographer and a performer in the ballet Eugene Darcy at the nearby King's Club. Bisexual playwright Andres Perez also worked as a dancer for Beam Bam Boom, and in 2001 he said there is nothing new about homosexuality in the theater. Slide. The world's first transsexual vedette, Coccinelle, changed her sex in France in 1958. This French vedette performed in Bim Bam Boom in 1970. According to gay chronicler Pedro Lemebel, the people of Santiago were pushing at the theater doors to see her and were impressed with her overwhelming beauty and her artificial breasts, which she exposed for them. Slide. You have to see her. She's beautiful. Tino Ortiz, owner of the famous Boate Manhattan in Arica in the north of Chile, contracted the work of Cuban transvestite Ruben Duval, who he discovered in Lima. Duval performed in the Manhattan, stripping down to a bikini. According to Ortiz's son, the audience was shocked at first, but ended up applauding. Duval became known as the Cuban Coccinelle. Tino Ortiz also managed to bring Coccinelle to the Manhattan in Arica in 1970. In 1967, Tino Ortiz went to Santiago and helped organize a group of transvestite performance artists into the Blue Ballet, the Ballet Azul, referencing a football team, soccer team, and brought them to Arica to perform in the Boat Manhattan, where they did striptease without revealing their sex. Protests led to the police shutting down the show, so they went to the Boat El Dorado in Antofagasta. Again facing problems, they left to perform in the Café Checo de Valparaíso, where they caught the attention of Bim Bam Boom and were eventually contracted. In May 1973, they left to tour in Europe for years. They all became women. One of the members of this performance group reached unprecedented fame in Chile, Candy Dubois. Candy had started dancing at a very young age at a restaurant in Valparaíso after leaving home at the age of 10. She met choreographer Paco Marena, who helped her find work in the cabarets of Santiago, where she met Tino Ortiz and joined the Blue Ballet. After touring Europe with the Blue Ballet, Candy Dubois returned to Chile in the early 1980s as a woman who now dominated many languages and had married a Frenchman. With her transsexual colleague Monique, they opened Le Trianon in 1984, a French restaurant with an 8:30 cabaret-style show. She performed with great success there and elsewhere, even including the Hotel Hyatt. Her fame continued in the return to democracy and even following her death by cancer in 1995. Candy played with a sexual ambiguity, and when asked if she was male or female, she responded, quote, "I don't care what people think. If I were to reveal that, my personality would lose all of its charm." My paper, slide, here's Candy in all of her glory. My paper demonstrates that striptease and other sexual performance are critical to both challenging and reinforcing gender and sexuality in state and society. While sexual performance can certainly be an arena for exploitation, the stories and information I have presented here show that it can also be a space for free expression and appreciation of diverse bodies, for eluding sexual categorization, and for imagining new narratives of sexual selfhood. The sexual performance industry transcends state and regime politics in Chile, belonging just as much to the democratic left and right as it does to the dictatorship. Yet in the context of the national and international sexual performance market, such performance can become highly political in terms of the politics surrounding these bodies and who is allowed to perform what, where. I maintain that there is nothing inherently shameful about striptease and sexual performance, and it is crucial to recognize both the sources and the effects of imbuing such performance with shame. I have one more slide before I open this up to questions. It's fortuitous that I'm presenting this today, which is national, and it's the National Day of Trans Remembrance here and in Chile also. This picture is of Hija de Perra. I would like to dedicate my presentation today to her. She is one of my favorite sexual politics performers, and she lost her life to AIDS shortly after I left Chile. Thank you. So, anybody have questions or comments for me? Yes?
I was wondering if you came across in research any venues that were dedicated specifically to gay or lesbian clientele, or if that wasn't something.
Yes, you see that more in the 1980s, by the late 1980s. Le Trianon, Candy Dubois' cabaret restaurant was specifically directed at a gay, transvestite, sexually ambiguous clientele. Places for lesbians, not so much, no, still today. And yeah, I mean, I think that would be the one. And there were other places that started popping up too in the late 80s. There was certainly a scene there that was somewhat clandestine. Yes?
I have a question. So, the way you're looking at this is, what's the difference between transgender, transsexual, and just female impersonators? And then that, like, because some of them you said
Right.
actually had surgeries to become female, but then others were just
Right.
performers. What is?
That's a good question. Transsexual refers specifically to people who have had operations to change their sex. Transgender is a more kind of umbrella term that I use to include transsexual people as well as transvestites who usually or often dress sometimes as a man and sometimes as a woman, or as very sexually ambiguous. And a lot of people kind of reject those terms altogether and reject kind of notions of gender and prefer to just take on an identity that is sexually ambiguous or that has nothing to do with sex.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have a lot of questions.
Go ahead.
What's the relationship between sex work and sexual performance? So were some of these performers actually providing sexual services on the side, or was that a separate venue like the brothel, or was there some of like blurry edges?
Until brothels were prohibited in 1983, there were separate businesses that were specifically designated as brothels, which were regulated by the government. But there was certainly kind of an idea that a lot of people had that some of these cabarets and nightclubs were places of prostitution. More so the boîtes, which is where women had to drink with clients in order to get them to consume alcohol. And in a lot of those places, there were women, I think, women and transvestites who left the establishments to perform sexual commerce, or to work in sexual commerce. But generally, I think it's important to keep these things separate, because these businesses were not designated for sexual commerce. They were designated for sexual performance. And certainly most of the women there, and transsexuals and transvestites, did not engage in sexual commerce. But one of my arguments, right, is that when the brothels were prohibited in 1983, that distinction became blurrier. Because now cafés con piernas, certainly the ones that have their windows blacked out, those are kind of understood by a lot of people in Chilean society to operate, to function essentially as brothels. Mm-hmm. Yes.
If I may, thank you. That's including pictures. Great presentation. What would you use as the best English translation for vedette?
Showgirl.
Showgirl?
Mhm.
Okay, not stripper. Is that what you're
No.
Okay.
No.
Showgirl.
Showgirl.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
And I have another question, which is, I think there's a line through your talk that engages a question really. A question that's really central to Chilean work on the dictatorship, and that is from the critique. I think it was Larraín was talking about sexual performance under the dictatorship as a sign of decay in artistic performance, and sort of the crudity of the military dictatorship. And your argument goes against that.
Mm-hmm.
And Larraín is in good company, right? Critiques of consumerism, of anything from the left under the dictatorship is when everything went bad, right? And yet when you finish talking about the links between military and police officials and vedettes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You say the military co-opted the sexual performance market. And I wonder if you could tell us more about that, because on one reading of that connection would be to say that the military and the officers were the police were the new clients, the new clientele of the vedettes, the best position to pay them, to protect them at night, and so forth. So what are you calling co-optation in this context? Because in some ways, it's not the Christian Democrats and the socialists anymore who are watching the vedettes, it's the military officials. So what does that change about in your analysis?
Right. I mean that specifically referring to who was composing the clientele.
Mm-hmm.
And under the dictatorship, you see that it becomes the police and the military and people who are cooperating with them in other businesses, reporters and other entertainers.
Like a perk. Right.
Right, but certainly because, especially because of the curfew, it becomes really difficult for a lot of people to even leave their houses at night. So it does become a space where that's primarily occupied in the clientele by police and military and collaborators.
Mm-hmm.
If I can use that word. But there's also, I think you mentioned the economic point of it too. It's also who could pay for this, and certainly with the economic crisis and everything, that becomes a big issue too, where you're looking at a very elite part of the population.
Mm-hmm. So the vedettes and the cafes and so forth, the sexual commerce the sexual performance industry gets co-opted as a whole, or just certain individuals?
Not co-opted as a whole, because we have, as I spoke, there's evidence also of these clandestine places that are operating where you have to knock with a coin, and then the places where people just stay out all night. But I think I mean it as co-opted kind of in the imagining of the sexual performance industry, where those women who specifically who were known to be working with the military and police became famous, and that representation kind of changed the imagining of all of this in Chilean society. Other questions and comments? Go ahead.
Please.
Yes.
Please. So I thought it was really interesting the use of this idea about shame as sort of like a central sort of lens that you're looking at these different performances. And you really get the idea that from the left point of view, working in this sexual performer or as a prostitute or anything would be considered shameful, and then as you progress. But when you get to the transgender performers, how does shame work there? Is it that there's an expression that they're overcoming shame, or do you have any information on how they?
Yes. One thing that Hija de Guerra said is that there's no such thing as a transvestite that's not brave, and I think that comment kind of gets starts to answer your question a little bit, where I think people who are working, who are expressing their bodies as something outside of what society and culture is dictating or the norms, they're already kind of crossing a boundary and taking responsibility for their own representation, sexual representation, kind of rewriting their sexual representation, like imagining a new narrative of themselves. I think it's a really good question. I mean, a lot of transvestites that I spoke to kind of dealt with this, or spoke of the way that society perverts their souls, and so I think it's important to when I'm by deconstructing shame, you can get to kind of the bravery that's there, and people who are rejecting that idea of shame and going out and carrying on with who they really want to be, despite ideas of shame that society might try to make them feel.
So is sexual performance empowering within your kind of concept of it in terms of, and that's what you're
right,
saying.
I certainly think it can be empowering, certainly. And it's, it's empowering in that it's a place where non-normative bodies are encouraged to perform and express themselves. And you see this also in the United States, where transsexuality comes through entertainment, with Christine Jorgensen, who also got a sex change in France. And her kind of the publicity that it caused when she returned as a showgirl made the medical community look at transsexuality and made the medical community kind of deal with these issues. So I think that sexual performance is a really important arena historically for making transgender, sexually ambiguous, transsexual people visible, and bringing it into issues of larger society, bringing it into a larger society context. If that makes sense. Yes.
Going off of the idea of shame with the industry, did you have any issues with any of your interviews as far as like shame goes and people not being willing to talk about their profession or anything like that?
Yes, and like I mentioned, the one oral interview I did with the woman who worked in a café con piernas in the 80s, she, like I said, she admitted that like very reluctantly and with anguish. Like, she really didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to tell me. And then she told me, and then she really didn't want to talk about it. And I kept asking her more questions, and she's just like, let's move on, talk about something else. So certainly for her, working in a café con piernas in the 80s, even though she had on clothes and it wasn't striptease by any means, it was still, I think for her, a very shameful experience that she was very reluctant to share with me. But that's really the only instance I can think of from the interviews that I did. Anybody else? Thank you all so much for coming.